or not? Okay, anticlimactic. I'm recording. Hopefully that went over. Okay, let's see. We're going to pick up from our review last week. Right here. All right, so we were talking about Wycliffe last week. We were talking about how we had the Peasants' Revolt, if you remember that, the Peasants' Revolt, and he had to rebuke them, the lollards and the peasants who were involved in the violence in an attempt to reform the church and state. And he preached against that. He taught against that. He began to write his works. At some point, he began to write in English exclusively. He no longer wrote in Latin because he really wanted the people to read his writings. And the English people became his focus and his heart. And so Wycliffe began the work of translation. There weren't any other accessible English translations at the time. The other English translations had been done, but not of the complete Bible, and nothing recently, not within the last, I don't think the last 7 centuries, if my timeline's correct. And so the English people just did not have access to an English Bible. And there was a number of reasons why. One of the reasons was because, and it wasn't just English that we're talking about, other vernacular languages or other languages were having trouble getting a Bible as well. And a lot of it had to do with the different councils and the Pope who were restricting translation. So Pope Innocent III to the Bishop of Mentz, he says, clearly no simple or unlearned person should presume to touch the sublimity of sacred scripture or to preach it to others, that they should be seized for trial and penalties who engage in the translation of the sacred volumes, or who hold secret covenantals. I have a hard time. I can read it just fine. I just can't pronounce it. Or who assume the office of preaching without the authority of their superiors, against whom the process shall be commenced without any permission of appeal. So here, no one is allowed to preach or teach the scripture unless they are learned. They will determine who is learned. And you are not allowed to engage in the translation or hold secret meetings or assume the office of preaching without the authority of the Roman bishops, Roman priests, and so on. So we couldn't have a translation done. Catholics will say, well, it's primarily because they didn't want uneducated people providing translations. And that's all well and good. I don't want uneducated people providing translations either. However, if there's a need and a desire in that language for the translation, then you, as the ruling authority, the bishop of the area, if it was the only local church in the area, then it is your duty to provide this translation. If you're preaching from the Bible, you're already translating from it. If you're preaching from the Bible, that's the key word there. Oftentimes they weren't. Yeah, they were restricting translation. This is Metz. So we went more into detail last week about this, but Metz is France. This one is Toulouse. We prohibit also the laity should be permitted to have the books of the Old and New Testament unless anyone from the motives of devotion should wish to have the Psalter or the Breviary for divine offices or the hours of the Blessed Virgin, but we most strictly forbid their having any translation of this book. All right, so this one is the Council of Toulouse. Their council is primarily against the Albigensians, and the Albigensians are a heretical group, very Gnostic. We went through the things that they believed last week. And after the Council of Toulouse, the Western Church in that area raised up an army and slaughtered the Albigensians. I do agree that they were heretics. I disagree with how they handled the heretics. I also disagree with the fact that just because there were heresies from people misusing the Bible, to prohibit the use of the Bible. I think the opposite is what's needed. Give the Bible. Expound it appropriately and do that right. And it's a battle of ideas and have the better idea by pulling from the text correctly, not killing people. That is not what Christ called us to do. Our kingdom is not of this world. So that was the Albigensians. Again, this was a prohibition for anybody to have the books of the Old and New Testament. Again, this is the opposite reaction we're looking for. Then last week, we talked about the next council, the Council of Tarragona, and I said, take it with a grain of salt because I couldn't fact check it. And I'll tell you, it eats away at me when I can't fact check something, especially when I think there's some reason to believe it exists. I am either looking for affirmation that it doesn't exist or finding it. So I couldn't find affirmation that it didn't exist, but I had a really hard time finding it. And if you notice, last week, I had up there the Council of Tarragona, I believe 1242. This week, it's 1233 because I did some more work. Actually, Sunday afternoon last week, I went home, still bothered the fact that I couldn't do it. And so I went to a resource that I used to use a lot more frequently than I do now, and that's AI. And I just went into AI and asked a simple question. I asked the question, why is there confusion between the Council of Tarragona of 1234 and the Council of Tarragona at 1242? Why is there confusion of dates? That's what I was particularly asking. And AI returned and said, there is no confusion. Those are two councils that both happened. And I was like, I can't find any source. So AI is conversational. So you can just talk to AI like you would talk to a normal person. So I just wrote back. I said, I cannot find any source for the Council of Tarragona at 1234. And they said, 1234 council did indeed happen. It was a smaller council than the 1242 council, but it did occur. And I said, can you provide sources for that? And they provided me with 3 books. The first book I got, I could not confirm the information in it because before I buy it, I try to see if I can get like summaries, and you can ask AI to give you a summary of a particular chapter of any book and so on and so forth. So I was working through it and I opted not to get it because I couldn't confirm the information. So then I looked at the second book, and the second book is the one that's screenshot on your screen. And that one, the left side is the actual book. The right side is a translation. So I use a Google translator, so it translates it for me. And so this is the collection of canons and all of the councils, the Spanish council, with notes and illustrations by D. Juan Tejeda T. Ramiro. So this was huge for me because this was the first time I actually got a source that was going to list what happened at these councils, all of them. So they've got each chapter of this book is a council and a summary of what happened at the council, and then the canons that the council came up with. And I was like, this is the resource I've been looking for. And so when you open it in this particular book, you'll see that it's a 2-column text. The left column is the Latin, which was what I was looking for. I wanted the Latin because remember, one of the arguments was that this was a poor translation. Now I wanted to see how it was translated. And on the right column was the Spanish translation of the Latin. And since Tarragona took place in what will become Spain, it's not Spain yet at that time, but that area, the Spanish-speaking people, this was exactly what I was looking for. I'm looking for a source material in the area, in the right time frame. Well, no, this one's not. I think this was done later, 1800s, I think, but it's in the right area. And so that's what I was looking for. Now, I generally don't use AI a lot anymore because I've been burned multiple times by it. AI has steered me in the wrong direction more than once. I will give you an example. If you remember when we were talking about the Masoretic text, and we were talking about Rudolf Kittel and Gerard Kittel, and how Gerard Kittel became a Nazi, and so on and so forth. And we talked about that. When I first heard Dan Hafley's argument in that direction for Gerard Kittle becoming a Nazi, I asked AI a question. I don't remember what the question was that I asked it at the time, but the return answer is that Rudolph and Gerard were Jews. And I was like, how does a Jew become a Nazi? And I began to ask that question. And it took me down this wild road of history. And then I went and I started asking for sources, as you should do. If you use AI, ask for sources. And they couldn't provide me with any. Major red flag when they say, I can't provide you with a source with that. Then I take anything that was just said with a grain of salt. And I began to do my own work. They're not Jews. They were German people. There was no Jewish connection. And I generally will find that when I work with AI, I will ask follow-up question after follow-up question after follow-up question to get a complete sense of what's going on, and then ask for sources, and then go do my work. Because now I have some information that I'm looking for. On more than one occasion, when I was doing the early stuff in this class that we're doing, we're talking about languages. Now I'm fairly well versed in language, so I can ask some educated questions. And it would say stuff, and I'm like, that can't be true because of this piece of information. And they're like, oh, you're right. You're correct. I'm sorry I misled you. And I was like, so early on, I already knew that I should be careful with this tool. However, it's still a tool. It's a tool like any other. And this tool actually helped me. After doing all the work myself, I have a software that I use called Logos. Logos is a great software. It's super powerful. And I can't tell you how many books I have. I have tens of thousands of books I have access to. And I was searching for this canon in my tens of thousands of books, and I was getting 0 returns. And so that's what made me super suspicious. So I was doing all sorts of work to find this. And so that AI was able to pull this book out of Google Books and give me this information was super helpful. What's also fascinating is I asked it about the 1234 Council. I still can't find a 1234 Council. This particular document says the council takes place in 1233. And so since this document says 1233, the only thing I could think of, I'm being charitable here, is that maybe the council took place in 1233 and then the canons were published in 1234 the following year. Maybe. So maybe there's some confusion with the dates. In any event, I was able to track down this quote from that source. And what else? I was going to say something else about this. But yeah, that was massively helpful to me. Oh, that's what I was going to say. I did that last Sunday afternoon. When I sat down to prepare the slides yesterday, I went back to AI and I asked the same question. And you know what AI told me? The council at 1233 never existed. And I was like, I had the screenshots already done because I took the screenshots last week and I sent it. I said, well, what do you do with this then? And I was like, oh, I'm sorry. You are correct. I'm sorry I misled you. I was like, be careful with AI is all I'm saying. It's a good tool, but it's not a sharp tool. So you might have to sharpen it a little bit. I was like, I was like, oh, great. I'm back to square one then. What do you mean I literally am reading it. So the translation of this is no one may possess the books of the Old and New Testament in the Romance language, and if anyone possesses them, he must return them over to the local bishop within 8 days after the promulgation of this decree, so that it may be burned. All right, and that was the quote. And the pushback was this was a bad translation. So I had the Latin. I asked Google to translate the Latin for me. This can all be hit or miss as well, but you can usually tell when it's a miss because it doesn't make any sense when you ask Google to do a translation. So here is on the top up here, this is the Latin. This is what I was actually searching. That's why it was on the highlighted there. It's not highlighted in the document, but that was my search result. And so here it says, likewise, it is decreed that no one should have any of the books of the Old or New Testament in Romance. And if anyone has, within 8 days after the publication of this Constitution, from the time of the sentence, shall deliver the body to the bishop of the place to be burned. And if he does not do this, whether he is a cleric or a layman, he is to be held as a suspect of heresy until he has purified himself. So the translation's actually pretty good. The one that's typewritten up there is the one that is just a translation into modern English. And the one that's in the screenshot is closer to a more word for word translation, if you will, that makes the English not work very well. What I did find interesting, though, someone asked me last week, I don't remember who it was, but someone said Romance languages sounds anachronistic. Did they actually call their languages Romance languages in that day? Apparently they did. So I wasn't sure either, but I went and looked it up, and that does seem to be the case. I forgot to double check if I misquoted this because I stumbled all over it last week. And I forgot to check, and I remembered first thing this morning when I was here. So this is Wycliffe's response. The truth of God stands not in one language more than another. An English Bible may edify the lewd people as it does the clerks in Latin. Why may we not write in English the gospel and other things, the dedication of the gospel to the edification of men's souls? And so Wycliffe does the work, and he finishes the work and he dies in 1384. That's important to remember. The Lollards pick up his work and keep making copies and updates because the English language is changing really fast at this point in time. In fact, by the time of the 1400s, early 1400s, only 16 years after Wycliffe has died, his translation is nearly obsolete and it's getting an update. And that update is done by William Purvey. And so we talked about that. And we talked about Thomas Arundel, who asked that if anybody, basically, he's attacking the Lollards. If anyone reproduces Wycliffe's works, to allow them to be burned. And his request for that law got passed. And William Saltrey was the first one burned at the stake in 1401. And then, so we got Wycliffe over here in England being burned, and his works make it all the way over here to just west of Poland. And that's where we meet Jan Hus. And Hus is the Czech word for goose. And his works, Wycliffe's works, are massively influential on Jan Hus. And Jan Hus is arrested and tried as a heretic. Before they arrest and try Jan Hus, they try Wycliffe again for heresy posthumously. He's already dead. They try him for heresy, they convict him, they dig up his bones, and they burn his bones. And then immediately after, now that they've condemned Wycliffe, now they have precedence for condemning Jan Hus. So they use the same arguments and they condemn Jan Hus. And Jan Hus, as he's being tied to the stake, remember his name, Jan Hus itself, Jan is John, Hus is goose. And so he says, as he's being burned, you may cook this goose, but 100 years from now will come a swan that you will neither catch nor boil. And about 100 years later, Martin Luther has his 95 Theses pasted to the Church of Wittenberg. And later, when he's tried and arrested for heresy, he is accused of being a Hussite. He denies it because he doesn't know who they are. And then when he asks for a night to think about how he's going to respond, they give it to him. And while he's taking that time, he says, "Get me Jan Hus's works. I want to see him." And he reads as much as he can in that time. And he comes back and he says that he likes the Hussites and Jan Hus. And then later he identifies himself as the swan that could be neither caught nor boiled. And he was not caught nor boiled. And he was roughly very close to 100 years later. So I think that's a pretty powerful story. And so that's where we are pretty much ending with Wycliffe. I have two Bibles up here. This one is a facsimile of Wycliffe's Bible. So remember, his was hand done. So you can actually go through and see his work. This is just the New Testament. They do have an Old Testament copy that I never got. You'll also see how hard it is to read this if you come and look at this. This is, if you think the King James is hard, this is 100 times harder. There's about maybe 1 or 2 words per line that you can pick up, sometimes 3 or 4 if you get lucky, but it's definitely a different English, different spelling, different pronunciation. It's very different than anything we're used to. So this is a facsimile of Wycliffe's work. This is a modern update. In other words, it's modern spelling and modern words if the words have gone out of use of William Purvey's update to Wycliffe's Bible. So if you guys are interested, this one does not retain all the artwork and pretty drop caps or anything of that nature. It's really just a pure text. But if you guys are interested in looking at these after class, just come up and grab them. I'll leave them right here. All right, and then we ended the class with Wycliffe talking to us from his preface, and we'll end Wycliffe again the same way. What I did this week, and I'll do in future weeks, sorry, my throat is losing my voice here. What I did with Wycliffe this week and what I'm going to do with future ones is I'm going to transcribe them and put them next to the thing so you can read along as he's talking if the muffling is hard to hear. And so we'll go ahead and do that.
The friars, with their followers, say that it is heresy to write God's law in English and make it known to ignorant men. It seems first that the knowledge of God's law should be taught in the language which is best known, because this knowledge is God's word. When Christ says in the gospel that both heaven and earth shall pass away, but his word shall not, he means that his knowledge shall not pass away. Also, the Holy Spirit gave the apostles knowledge of languages to teach the people God's law. And so, God willed that the people be taught his law in diverse tongues. For this reason, Jerome labored and translated the Bible from diverse tongues into Latin. Christ and his apostles taught the people in the tongue that was best known to them. Why should men not do so now? Preventing such knowledge of the gospel is the same as preventing Englishmen from following Christ and coming to heaven.
All right. And so that ends Wycliffe. Wycliffe, massively impactful on me, as well as I began to work through his works and his love and his desire for the English people and to give them a Bible in their own language. If you remember correctly, just as a point of refresher, actually, I'll refresh it when I get there. So now we're going to move about 80 years into the future, only 80 years. And we're going to talk about Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam, Dutch humanist, Roman Church priest, scholar, and monk. Much of what I'm going to teach you is going to come from a biography I used as my primary source material from Roland H. Baton. I think the title of the book, I didn't write it down for some reason. I wrote the author, but not the title, is Erasmus of Christendom. And it's a great book. It was very helpful in my work for this section. So we're about 82 years into the future after Wycliffe's death. And as usual, I want to kind of set up some background information. What's the world look like when Erasmus is alive? What's changed? When we last left off, the Lollards were really doing the work of Wycliffe. They were making copies of the Bible. They were preaching his sermons and his truths and so on. And they were pushed underground through heavy persecution. So no one's really hearing from them. in the early times of Erasmus. And so once the Reformation kicks off, they'll come out from underground and we'll hear from them. We won't hear from them again, but the Reformation will. And they will join the Reformation on the side of the reformers. Basically, they're going to see the fire that came from Wycliffe's spark. So it's a beautiful thing. And so we'll look at the world map. We'll see what's changed. It's a slightly different world map. I chose this one because it gave more of the, I actually prefer the other map that I used better, where it had just kind of the chunks of places to let you know, like the political sphere. This still has it, but what was called the Holy Roman Empire is all of this stuff in here that's in red. It has this red border. That's the Holy Roman Empire. Not much has changed. England is still there. Scotland, the landscape's not changed a whole lot. What has changed is Spain is now a proper country. Okay, it wasn't before, so that's changed in the last 80-ish years. Remember the Golden Horde that was over here? It's gone. It's no longer a threat to the West anymore. It's fractured. It's been defeated multiple times, and it's not pushing any further west. The biggest change, and the change that's going to impact this time period more than any other, is that the Byzantine Empire is gone. All right. If you remember, the Ottoman Empire was this tiny little country. It was barely worth calling an empire. It has taken over the Byzantine Empire, and all of this purple is gone from a little footnote on the left side of the screen to now a massive part of the map. So they are a true threat. The Byzantine Empire is gone. And if you've been keeping track with the Byzantine Empire from early, when we were talking about it all the way back with Jerome, who's there? Who are the Christians there? That's what we would identify as the Eastern Orthodox Church. The Eastern Orthodox Church were Greek-speaking Christians. And they had a Greek Bible. That was their Bible. Their Bible was a Greek Bible. So in the Old Testament, they used the Greek Septuagint. And in the New Testament, they used copies of the Greek New Testament. They didn't have to translate it. They were maintaining just copies of the Greek New Testament. But with the fall of the Byzantine Empire and the Ottoman Empire taking over, these are Muslims. They are slaughtering all the Christians. And so the Christians are fleeing west. And so for the first time in any recent history, we're going to have the Greek Bible meet the Latin Bible and the Masoretic text. These three texts, not only are we going to get a reformation of doctrine, but we're going to have a reformation of the Bible itself. And that's this section. As we get the Latin text, the Greek text, and the Masoretic text are all going to meet in the West for the first time in a very long time due to this Ottoman Empire. And another thing we've got to keep in mind is a massive invention in technology. So after Wycliffe's death and before Erasmus's birth, we have the Gutenberg press done by Johannes Gutenberg. Remember, China had already had a printing press. Their printing press in China would move east to Japan and west to Korea? Yeah, and west to Korea. So the printing press is in the east already. Johannes Gutenberg is a metal worker, and he has a business selling metal mirrors, and it is failing. He is losing money, he's bleeding money, and so he tries a new venture. He decides that he wants to recoup the money from his mirror business by creating a printing press. He wants a fast printing press. And he's a metal worker, so he can create the characters that will become the stamps for the printing press. And so he does that he comes up with this idea in 1436. By 1440, he's printing his first pages. He's got a prototype, a working prototype that's functional. Sorry, in 1440, he doesn't have a working prototype. In 1440, he has the designs laid out. He has the designs laid out, and he's in the process of actually making it. In 1450 is when he gets his prototype. So it takes him about 10 years to get this working. He has a prototype and he begins to use it. 4 years later, he's ready for commercial production. So 1454, he's ready to, all right, give me what you want and I will reproduce it. I'll print it. And so for the first few years, primarily, or for the first couple of years, I should say, primarily what he is printing are indulgences for the Catholic Church. Catholic Church says, or the Roman Catholic Church says, we need these indulgences so we can manipulate the laity people to buy them so that they can escape from hell and we can gather all of this money. And the faster they can print the indulgences, the faster they can sell them and the faster they can get that money in. And so Gutenberg makes his fortune off of indulgences. And so he's really just printing one page at a time. His very first attempt at a book, where he finally covers an entire book cover to cover, will become what we know as the Gutenberg Bible. The Gutenberg Bible was done around 1455. We're not exactly sure the exact date, but it's around 1455. He produces the first full book off of his printing press, and it's a copy of a 13th century Latin Vulgate known as the Parisian Bible. It's a update to Jerome's Latin Vulgate. Okay, the Latin Vulgate has been updated many times at this point. I didn't go through a family of Latin Vulgates because it's just huge. There's so many Latin Vulgates. Okay, and so this marks the beginning of the printed revolution. Texts that were expensive. If you remember correctly, a Wycliffe Bible was estimated to be roughly like $500,000 in today's money for an investment into Wycliffe's Bible. What that means is that the amount of time and money and materials and manpower that went into the Wycliffe Bible would be roughly the equivalent of 500 grand today. That's not to suggest necessarily that anyone paid that or a few people paid that, but that's what it would be worth, the amount of time it took to put into that. Gutenberg, he takes that cost of that Bible from $500,000, which would be inaccessible to the majority of people, even today. And he drives the price down to about 3 years' pay. Now, if you want a Bible, it's about 3 years' pay. Still very expensive. Nothing to shake your, nothing to be like, oh, that's great. So I just want to give you an idea of how quickly the cost went down, but it's still quite expensive. So 3 years' pay. And when I say 3 years' pay, I'm talking like minimum wage pay, not like the average person. So if you say, what, 20 grand or something a year is like a minimum wage job. So let's say roughly 60,000. So he's done a lot to drive down the price of a particular Bible. Still expensive, but way cheaper than it was before and way faster. And now, by the way, this is 1450 we're talking about, the cost of the Bible. By the time we're nearing the end of the Reformation, or actually I should say this, by the time of Tyndale and Luther, which is just right around the corner, a Bible is going to go for roughly 3 months' pay. That's what the printing press is going to do. It's going to go from 3 years' pay to roughly 3 months' pay. By the time we near the end of the Reformation, by the time we get to the end of the Reformation, we're looking at 3 weeks' pay. So the printing press is just, and what's the reason for this is because printing presses are popping up everywhere. Supply and demand is driving the cost down significantly. So within the next 100 years, roughly, we're going to be down to 3 weeks' pay for a Bible. Very accessible for the common person. Okay, 3 weeks is still no laughing matter. If you're going to chunk out 3 weeks' pay today for anything, you're going to think twice about it. It's still an investment, but it's within your doability. You're like, I can do this if I want this. And 3 weeks' pay is what it is. Today, we don't talk about how many weeks' pay or days' pay. We don't even talk about hours' pay. We talk about whether or not it's a half hour of pay or less to get a Bible. Okay. So just to give you a sense for what the printing press is going to do. So the printing press, not only does it drive the cost down, it also drives, it makes a massive amounts of changes in the world as we know it. It's going to impact literacy rates because before, books in general, just super expensive to make and time consuming. And so you didn't buy a book frivolously. You bought a book out of necessity because you were probably a scholar or in school or something of that nature, and you needed a book, but you weren't reading necessarily for pleasure. If you were reading someone else's book, which came from someone else, which came from someone else, which came from someone else. And it's just been handed around because nobody could afford to buy a fresh one. So literacy rates are going to skyrocket because now people have something to read. There are things coming off the printing press. It's going to impact common language. So nowadays, when we talk about dialects, they're not quite the same as the dialects that would exist in Gutenberg's day. Dialects back then would be a much larger difference in a smaller geographic location. So I'll give you an example. These are the English dialects in England in the 1400s. Each of the shades are dialects that are similar, but still distinct. And then each color difference is a large, significant dialect difference to the degree that there might be some communication issues between that color dialect and another color dialect. And so it would be, it's even hard to give you an analogy today, but it would be kind of the same sort of thing where we have, I'm not talking about like Boston accent or dialect in Texas. I'm talking about more like American and South African and Australian and England and Scottish English. All of those Englishes that the people speak around the world in far away locations having different words for the same items, different grammar, different pronunciation. Okay. What the printing press is going to do for this is when you're going to create a book as a printer, because you want the largest customer base possible, you're going to print in the largest dialect. Whatever is the biggest dialect is what you're going to print in because you want the largest customer base. Well, other people want to read that book too, and they can. It's accessible to them, though maybe difficult. And so the dialect differences start to decrease drastically due to printing presses. They start to standardize languages more. This is also very helpful for nations who are trying to have a united people. It's really good for a united country to have the same language if you want to create strong borders. And so this is really impactful. And in fact, the Gutenberg press is going to be, it doesn't matter what list you look up. You can look up any list of the greatest inventions of all time, and the Gutenberg press is likely to be somewhere on that list, upwards next to fire. Although fire's not an invention, it's only a harnessing. Anyway, so this is going to be massively influential on standardizing languages. It's going to take language change and grind it to a snail's pace because it's going to be slower to have language change happening from one generation to the next. If you could understand how quickly Wycliffe's day had changed just between his birth and his death, one of the reasons people wrote in Latin is because it was, generally speaking, it wasn't a living language. It wasn't a language people spoke conversationally. They wrote it down. And so it was easy to maintain what things meant in a language that wasn't changing because it wasn't conversation. But English was conversational and it was changing rapidly. If you think English is changing rapidly today, you should understand what was happening in Wycliffe's day because it was completely different. Imagine your pronunciation changing from one generation to the next on how you pronounce words. Never mind what words mean and how they came about. So massively influential. This is happening just before Erasmus is born. This is going to be impactful to the world. It's not just impactful on Christianity. It's impactful how we got our Bible. I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to get into this next section because it doesn't, I'll leave you on a cliffhanger. But we're going to talk about we're going to talk about the rise of humanism next week. And that's just because you need to know why Erasmus is a Dutch humanist. You need to know what a humanist is. And it's not what you think it is in today's terminology. Today, when we talk about a humanist, we're talking about someone generally who starts with the presupposition that there is no supernatural. They're generally atheistic in their approach to their worldview. There are other things that will overlap in humanism between Erasmus's day and today, but generally speaking, their worldview is completely different. Erasmus did not deny the supernatural. He is a Christian, and but he is a humanist. And we'll talk about what that means next week and the people who influenced him into humanism. All right. With that being said, that's this week. We'll pick up with Desiderius Erasmus again next week. You guys are dismissed.